समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
As the Iran war drifts through an uneasy interregnum with intermittent strikes and a weaponized Hormuz, an undeniable reset is seen on the global energy map. America's status as an energy exporting powerhouse is redrawing that map, often in places one could least expect. Today, I'll be telling you why America's new energy frontier runs through Balkans in Europe and why New Delhi must know its significance. Let me introduce you to the UNESCO World Heritage City of Dubrovnik, the Pearl of the Adriatic, globally romanticized as a filming location for the iconic web series Game of Thrones. You know, the US Energy Secretary Chris Wright was there recently, in fact, days ago, and media attention followed. Against the backdrop of Renaissance walls and Baroque facades, Wright spoke of the strategic arc stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic and onward to the Black Sea, and its relevance for the US energy export infrastructure. Now, for the record, Wright was speaking at the 3Cs initiative, or the 3SI, a framework of connectivity and infrastructure projects spanning 13 European countries, shoring the Baltic, Adriatic, and Black Sea regions, aka the 3Cs. Now, as a policy framework, it has existed within European policy discourse since its launch in 2015, which is almost a decade ago, but has rarely garnered a wider international attention, at least until now. Wright also made a political point as much as an economic one. The recent US maneuvers with billions in investments in key LNG projects in select countries in the Balkans for now that are also part of the EU aid programs for EU accession. Now, all this has openly contrasted the rigid regulatory outlook of Western Europe with what Washington is promoting as a more agile, opportunity-driven approach in Central and Southeastern Europe. Unsurprisingly, it has become uncomfortable for the European establishment in Brussels. But first, let's understand the basics. What is the US pivot to Western Balkans all about? The region today sits uniquely at the intersection of the EU and American interests, Russian and Chinese influence, albeit in different degrees, expanding Turkish presence, and a hunger for more investments. Weak institutions, vulnerable economies, and unfinished state building have kept these countries far below their threshold potential. Many of them are not even members of the EU. Before we embark upon the details of US investments, 2 points need to be underscored. First, it is not an overnight development in the aftermath of the Iran war. Washington's economic interest in the region has been building steadily. The US Congress incorporated the Western Balkans Democracy and Prosperity Act into the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, for the fiscal year 2026, which was signed into law by Donald Trump on December 18, 2025. What the Iran war has done is to restart a larger discussion on global energy demands with 2 major verticals. A resurgence of hydrocarbon nationalism, epitomized by Trump's drill baby drill, and second, a structural push towards renewables and energy transition. Now, while both trends are real and both are accelerating simultaneously, global hydrocarbon demand remains enormous and is likely to remain upward for at least another decade. Also, note that the transition, wherever happening, is not happening in a linear fashion because not all renewable technologies substitute for all hydrocarbon uses equally or immediately. And this is something that partly explains why the UAE freed itself from OPEC production constraints to best utilize the coming decade, which may represent the last great window for maximizing hydrocarbon leverage before structural energy transitions deepen. But let's talk about the second vertical. While the US export scenario for oil is plush and US oil companies are raking in massive windfalls due to Hormuz disruptions, the challenge lies in exporting more United States gas. The paradox here is compelling. Import dependent countries across Europe and Asia are scrambling for scarce supplies after Qatar's LNG exports have shrunk. Now, the United States possesses enormous gas reserves and remains the world's largest producer, consumer, and exporter of natural gas, with domestic gas prices at a 17-month low, despite all the global turmoil around Hormuz. And yet, this cheap US gas cannot reach more overseas buyers because American LNG export terminals are already operating near maximum capacity and pipelines are already full. So, regardless of whether LNG prices soar or not, the United States cannot instantly convert much more gas into exportable LNG without major new infrastructure investments. And with this background, the dots can be connected better. That US limitation on gas exports makes regions like the Western Balkans even more strategically valuable. Their real value is as transit corridors, political footholds, and long-term infrastructure bets designed to anchor American energy into Europe, not for a year or two, but for decades. And I think it is also important to remind that US is already a major LNG supplier to Europe after the bloc diversified away from Russian gas dependence after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But with Qatar's export disruptions, there is even more incentive for the US to find these footholds. Additionally, US's move undercuts Russian dependence for many of these poor countries that are not part of the EU. Bosnia, for instance, alone imports roughly 225 million cubic meters of Russian gas annually via the Turk Stream and possesses virtually no domestic gas production capacity of its own. Diversification with robust US investments, expectedly, is more than welcomed by Sarajevo. Now, the question to ask is, why the Western Balkans? What's so special about this region? I had earlier mentioned that the current phase of US engagements in the 3SI, which is the Three Seas Initiative, focus on select Balkan countries. Now, these countries are Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Albania. Now, Croatia is a part of both the EU and NATO. Bosnia-Herzegovina is neither a part of the EU nor the NATO, but Albania is a part of NATO but not a part of the EU. As of now, the centerpiece US deal is the $1.5 billion pipeline project in southern interconnection between Bosnia and Croatia, linking the former with the Croatian LNG terminal in the island of Kirk and the wider pan-European gas networks. Kirk terminal is already a major conduit of US LNG into the European continent, and the deal will eventually get much more American gas into the region. Next, Albania has signed a 20-year framework agreement worth nearly $6 billion for American LNG imports, linking state energy company Albgas with US firm Venture Global and Greek infrastructure partners. And this process is unlikely to stop with Croatia, Bosnia, and Albania. Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia are all viewed as logical next steps if the initial projects succeed, particularly as Washington attempts to build an integrated energy and digital corridor across southeastern Europe in a permanent pivot. Now, in the long term, this would serve the transatlantic alliance's common goals of cutting Russian gas flows off the European bloc. But in the short term, contrasting visions of project disclosures and quick changes to legislations in the already vulnerable Balkans, struggling for decades with rule of law, curbing corruption, and democratic reforms, do pit the US and European methodologies for Balkans against each other. And that brings me to the final part of today's analysis, which is the India hook, where I will tell you how IMEC is linked to the Three Seas Initiative. The current discourse on IMEC corridor, which is meant to connect India to Europe via the Middle East, has had a strong diplomatic push ever since it was announced at the G20 summit in New Delhi in 2023, but a poor logistics outlay from the very beginning. The disruption of Hormuz, however, has necessitated a strategic urgency to diversify away from that dependence. What is actualizing now is a lattice of projects and network of infrastructures, what I called IMEC 2.0 in a recent piece. The same logic will apply to its European leg as well, with multiple strategic entry points into Europe, providing better access and logistics to the underexploited potential of Central, Southern, and Baltic Europe, wherein IMEC projects plugging into the 3Cs initiative projects is just a matter of when, not if. Therefore, US engagement unfolding in distant, picturesque tourist spots has a strategic and economic significance for India. And the Indo-Pacific watchers must know that Japan is already ahead of its regional peers in becoming a formal strategic partner of the 3Cs initiative. The next phase of developments in IMEC and in the 3Cs will see investments from like-minded partners, and opening New Delhi has every reason to analyze if it wants its place and stakes in transcontinental multimodal connectivity and infrastructure projects amid a fast-changing world order. And needless to say, I'll be back to discuss that and more. Stay tuned.